Going to go ahead and get started. So I just want to first welcome you to this Hofstra University Museum of Art Second Fridays program. My name is Karen Albert. I'm the Acting Director and Chief Curator here at the museum. I think everybody has, but if you haven't muted your microphone, please do so. It just prevents us from having extraneous noise and background feedback during the program. If you want to make comments or have questions during the program, please use the chat feature, which should be on your toolbar. And my co-host, Sasha Giordano, will help us with that as we go. She'll be watching that for questions. So this is, as I said, the Second Fridays program, What is a Print? And just before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about Hofstra University Museum of Art. I recognize some of your names and faces, so some of you are aware of what we do. But the museum's mission, along with that of the university, is to create an environment that encourages, nurtures, and supports learning through the free and open exchange of ideas. And we accomplish this through a broad range of exhibitions and programs that promote knowledge and understanding through experiences with works of art and authentic objects. We want to encourage dialogue and inquiry to make you consider an alternative point of view or see an issue from another perspective. And although the galleries are currently closed, the museum usually presents 4 to 6 exhibitions per year in the Emily Lowe and David Filderman galleries. So this fall, since we're closed, we've created this series called Second Fridays. Obviously, the virtual programs that are going to focus on different aspects of our permanent collection. So this is just a little recap about our permanent collection. We have more than 5,000 works of art, mainly American, European fine art, drawing, painting, photographs, print, sculpture, and other mixed media. We also have collections in African, Asian, Melanesian, and Central and South American works. The earliest works are from 1500 BCE, and they have up to date to the 21st century. So, and about 1,500 of the works are accessible through our website on an online database. And in the collection, one of the reasons why I'm focusing on prints is because our print collection is about 2,200 prints in our collection. So it's about not quite half of our collection, but close to. So I'm going to give you, in the program today, I'm going to talk about the different definitions of what the prints are and the different types of them and give you some examples. It's a lot of information. I tried to break it up a little bit. So there'll be plenty of time at the end also for questions if you have questions at the end, and we can do that with the microphones at the end. So what is a print? A print is a work of art that is composed of ink on paper that's created through an indirect transfer process. And one of the unique things about prints is that means they can be multiples. Okay. So the number of prints that are made are called an edition. Okay, so those are some of the terminology that I wanted to make sure you understand, because I'll be referring to it. The number in an edition depends upon, the artist and either the printer or the publisher, whoever they're working with, because this is often a very collaborative process, will decide how many can be in a print edition. And a print edition can be just 5 or it could be 500. It really depends on the process that's used and what the intention is. Probably one of the most often asked questions is about the numbering on the prints, and that's the edition numbering. And you can see I gave you a little example here. This is the one the print that I showed you at the beginning. This is numbered 134/200. So what that means is this is 134th print out of 200. Okay, so that's what that number means. Now the thing is with numbering, that was a fairly recent, in the history of print, that's a fairly recent invention. It's the mid 20th century really where that becomes very consistent about numbering prints. Previous to that, it wasn't common to do. And one of the other things that people need to understand about printmaking is each time you have a different color, you have a different block or plate or stone or screen for each color. And so that means the piece of paper has to, if it has 4 colors, it gets run through the press 4 times. So you have to have what's called registration, which means it lines up each time so that the print comes out in the right spot. Okay, so that's some of the terminology that I might refer to so that you have something to know what I'm talking about. So I talk about 4 major types of prints: relief, Italio, and then lithography and screen printing. Okay. So the different techniques are defined by what surface is printed. Okay. So, for example, in a relief print, which is most commonly going to be a wood block, it's the raised surface is what is inked and printed. In an Italio print, which are etchings and engravings, it's the incised or the cut into surface is where the ink lays, and that's where it gets printed from. In lithography and screen printing, they're actually a flat surface. And when I go into the types, you'll understand why it's flat. There's nothing that's inside, nothing's raised and nothing's cut into. So it's a flat surface printing process. So that's kind of, in general, how they're categorized. And within each category, there's lots of different subtleties and, different ways of accomplishing this. So, as I said, woodcuts are the most common relief prints. And it's exactly what you would think. It's cutting into a block of wood. And what you cut away is not printed, because the raised surface is what's going to be printed. Okay. And just the difference between woodcuts and wood engravings, I've had that question before. Wood engravings are made with an end grain wood block, so it's a much denser and harder wood, so you can get a much finer line and a finer cut. So the line is a little bit different. Whereas if you do most woodcuts, and I'm going to show you, this is the actual wood block of the Leonard Bascom print, The Poet Laureate. Okay, so this is a block of wood. Okay, it's not the print; it's the actual block. So a couple things to note with this is, and I'm going to show you some close-ups in a minute, and we'll kind of go over a little bit, is that the marks for the, okay, I'm going to go ahead and show you. This is the print from that block. Okay, so I'm going to do an above and below version here, so you can see it a little bit better, maybe to compare it in the same. It's hard because it's to get them big enough in the same screen. So you can see. I did a little close up here. You can see on that these thinner lines are the raised parts that are printed. So if you look on the shoulder over here and you got this line going down, that's the line over here on this side. So you can, so that you can see like the part that's gouged out in here is the white part. There's no ink in that part. I don't know if I'm losing people on this one. That's kind of hard to see. So the back here is on this upper left corner. That's raised and not cut into. So that prints black because that's where the ink sits. So everything that's, when you see all these little gouge marks and horizontal lines, that's where the wood has been removed. So these finer lines are what's being printed, because that's the raised surface. The other thing, I'm just going to go back to this one because I think you can see it. The other thing that you have to keep in mind when you're working on a print is the image is going to be reversed with a relief print, with a wood block. Not every print is that happens, but it does happen with this. Okay, so the image is opposite. So for example, let's see, that's probably easiest to see. The higher shoulder on the block is on your right, but the higher shoulder on the print is on the left, right? So it's reversed image. The other thing is that depending upon how fine your wood is, if your wood has a grain to it, you're gonna, on the block on the upper right here, you can see there's some graining of the wood. So on the print on the upper left, you can see there's some little white spots. That's from the actual grain of the wood. Now, this Baskin intentionally was using and leaving the grain of the wood in there. He wanted that part of his image. Other artists may not want that grain to show, so they could sand it down or whatever, you know, and make it smooth, so you wouldn't show that grain. Okay. So let's see. So let me go back to the. So I hope everybody's kind of clear about that process with the wood block. Now, wood blocks, as I said, have been around for a long time. I think I said that. I meant to say that anyway. Wood blocks are one of the oldest forms of printmaking. I think they found woodblock prints from the 5th century China are some of the earliest ones. So this is one of the earliest ones in our collection, and this is a work by the German artist Albrecht Dürer, and this is from his series called The Small Passion, which is about the later years of, the last years of Christ in his life. So this is actually when, I don't know how it's going to, this is when Christ reveals himself to the disciples during dinner at Emmaus. So this is a very, in that art historically, it's an image that reappears a lot. So this is actually quite small. That's the other thing you can't really tell on the screen. This is only 5 inches by 4 inches because it was printed as a little booklet. There was a series called The Small Passion. So it was printed as a small booklet. So a couple of the things I wanted to point out about prints being multiples. This actually, the original image was designed and printed in 1510. Dürer did this in 1510. This particular print that we have was a later print that was done in the late 16th or early 17th century. And the reason it can get printed later is because his widow inherited the wood blocks of his prints. So this was printed after his death. So the widow acquired, inherited the blocks, and then she actually sold them later on to somebody else. So there are other versions of this print from different time periods. And at this point, there was no additioning. There was none of that additioning numbering system. So we don't know exactly how many times it was printed. There's a record to a certain extent, or they know some of what was happening. But so there's a little. So many art, and I'll have a plate I'll show you later, where artists now often will do what they call canceling the plate, so it can't get reprinted later. One of the other things is prints nowadays, contemporary prints, you usually see the signature in the bottom margin, usually like in the center or to the right in the bottom margin. This one is not signed on the paper, but it's what's called, we call signed in the plate. And you see on the bottom left here, there's the AD. That's the Albrecht Dürer's signature he did in the plate, in the block. So that's the artist's signature right there. So it's not a handwritten signature, it's in the plate. Artists sometimes will still do that, but most of the time they sign the paper. Contemporarily sign the paper. Let's see, those were the main things I was going to say about that, I think. Yeah, so, and then the other thing is that, woodblock prints are not just European. Japan has a long tradition of woodblock prints. This is one by Ando Hiroshige. And part of what happens, I don't want to get too involved in Japan because I'm actually going to be talking about Japanese woodblock prints in our December second Fridays. So 2 sessions further on, we're going to talk about Japanese woodblock prints specifically. But they were done fairly inexpensively, meant for like the middle classes, meant for people to have as mementos of trips or traveling through Japan. These were not done in a printing press. These are all hand pressed, so it's a little bit of a different process. But again, you still need blocks for every color. So every color in this print was a different block. And the information on these colophones on the upper right and on the left were things like who was the artist who did the design, the title of the work, and there's a seal down here on the bottom right, and that tells you things like who is a publisher. In Japanese printmaking, we always mention it by the artist's name, but it was very collaborative. In Japanese printmaking, traditional Japanese printmaking, there was an artist, there was a woodblock carver, there was a printer, and there was a publisher. So it was a whole collaborative group of people that made these. And the publisher would say to the artist, I want to do a series on, this is from famous places in the province, 68 provinces, excuse me. So the publisher would say what the subject should be, and then the artist would do the designs, and then they'd be transferred to plates and things like that. So that's as I said, that's a little bit different than some of the European ones that we've been talking about, but that's another version of a woodblock print. Okay, and this is a more recent print by the American artist Alison Saar, and this, you can see in this print also the grain of the wood in the back, in the background, especially up in the top. You can see that that's the grain of the wood. So part of kind of what artists will, one of the reasons artists will choose to use a certain type of printmaking rather than another, one over the other, is because they create different effects. And woodblock prints, especially 20th and 21st century woodblock prints, the artists were really looking for that rougher, more rustic kind of feel of the wood. They wanted that to show through. Part of that comes from German Expressionist movement in the early 20th century. And many artists will continue to use woodblocks because they like that feeling that you can tell that it was carved, that you can tell that there was a woodblock. So the selection of the artist, what type of print they're going to make, often depends upon how they want it, how they want the final work to look. And then this is an example of a wood engraving. I mentioned before that wood engravings were done with the end cut of the wood, which is harder and denser, so you can get a finer line. So in this case, you're not seeing the grain of the wood, and that's intentional. The other thing about wood engravings is they were a little hardier and stood up to a larger edition of prints. They were often used throughout the 19th century up until the early 20th century as the illustrated newspapers. Things like Harper's Weekly were usually done with wood engravings until photography starts to take over, and photography and lithography start to take over illustrating periodicals. But for a long time, wood engravings were the method that were used. Winslow Homer did a whole series of wood engravings. He was an illustrator for Harper's Weekly, and they were all wood engravings. And because the wood is harder and denser, it lasted in the presses longer, so they could print more. So that's part of why the wood engraving was used. So that kind of gives you that idea. So those are all relief prints. So that means that the the surface on the top of the block is what was being inked and printed. So now we're going to move on to Italio Prints. Coming from the Italian tagliare, which means to incise or cut into. So the ink is sitting in the cut surface. It's not on the plane of the plate, it's below the plane of the plate. Traditionally, it's done with a metal plate, and sometimes it can be steel or copper is more typical today. And as I said, you would, if the image was put onto the metal plate, the ink would be applied to the plate and it goes into those cuts that are in the plate, and then they would wipe the surface clean, and then it would go into a printing press and the ink gets transferred to the paper. And one of the kind of unique things about Intaglio prints is called a plate mark. Because of the force of the paper and the plate going through the printing press, you get the outline of the metal plate on the edge of the paper. So from that pressure, you can see there's actually a little mark around the outside of the image. It's one of the ways you can tell to help you identify what type of print it is. And whether, so that's some basic information. So we're going to talk a little bit about, first we're going to talk about engravings. Engravings are cut into the plate using a burn, which is a very sharp, well-pointed steel cutting tool. It's a harder way to cut into the plate, because if you're thinking about you're using a metal implement to cut into a metal plate. It's not an easy task to do. So often the lines that are created are generally parallel lines, and they're using a hatching. It's not like when you're drawing and you can make a shadow and make a volume. Okay, you're using mainly line to do this, and I'm going to show you an example in a moment. Two other types that are technically engraving because they don't use etchings use an acid to be created, engravings don't. That's kind of one of the basic differences. Dry points are often used in conjunction with an etching, but that is when you actually use the burn and you cut another line into your plate, and rather than kind of cleaning up those little metal shavings, you leave them there, and then that ink gets trapped in that, and you get a little softer, blurrier line. And mesotints are a process that use a different type of tool. It's called a rocker. It's got a little wheel with a spike on it, and you really work the plate very hard to reveal a lot of that, incise a lot of the surface, so it holds a lot of ink. And I'm going to show you that in a moment. Oops, why is that not going? There we go. Okay. So this is an example of a steel engraving. This happens to be Henry VIII. It's from a series about the heads of illustrious persons of Great Britain from 1752. So a lot of times, again, similar to, in the sense of wood engraving, the steel engravings were used a lot in publishing. This was basically like a folio, like a book. So this is before photography. So how are you disseminating images? Usually it was through prints, engravings, and then more frequently etchings. So this is, I'm just going to show you, this gives you an idea of what the line looks like. This is just a detail of one little section of this engraving, where you can see that even though it may look like it's shaded and has volume in the original, and I can even go back so you can see how it is. And well, the part that we're looking at is just right down in here. So then this is the little detail of that area where you can see it's horizontal lines, and then it's vertical and horizontal lines, and then there's some that are in an angle to make that darker. because the more lines that are closer together, the darker that area is going to be, because the lines in the plate are holding the ink. Something that you have all the time, well, if you've been using cash, U.S. currency is an engraving. So if you look at currency, you'll see similar types of lines. Okay. Let's see. So I think that's about okay. Oh, and this is as I was mentioning, this was done for a book. So it was actually taken from the painting of Henry VIII by Hans Holbein the Younger, and then made into a print to be disseminated, for a larger population. So a couple of the things that obviously happen when you translate a painting into a print, especially in engraving, anyway, is you also have that reversal, right? So the artist who drew the engraving based it on this painting. And I'm just going to go back a couple. Down at the bottom here, I didn't enlarge it, but down at the bottom here it says Houbraken is the engraver, and that it's based on the Holbein down here. So he gives credit to where he got it from, so we know that he took it from this painting. But that was a very typical way that images were translated from paintings to prints and then disseminated to larger audience. So that's part of the reason why you would have done that. And the steel plates for this type of work would have lasted longer on a printing press than some other types of materials. Okay, and then we get to Robert Kipnis, and this is a Mesotint. Now, a Mesotint is the one I talked about that had the rocking tool that really cut in deep into the plate. And thanks to our donor, Jimmy White, who's on our meeting today. He had donated not only the print seclusion, but we also have the plate that goes with it. So that we have this copper plate, so I'm going to show you them next to each other in just a moment. So we can actually see how, see really clearly how that, how it actually gets printed. I just wanted to mention that because you can see it in this image clearly. Down the bottom here, Kipnis has put canceled on the plate, down on the bottom right-hand corner, so that somebody else can't ink the plate and make more. As I was mentioning in the Dürer, that things were printed after his lifetime. A lot of artists nowadays will do what they call canceling or striking the plate so it can't be reused. So he's canceled it down the bottom. Sometimes they'll make like a big scratch mark all the way across the image so that it can't be reused. But this way you can see the print is on your left and the copper plate is on your right. So again, you have the reversal of the image, right? Because you're putting the paper into it. So all of this darkness on the copper plate is the incised lines where the ink would sit. And then on the paper, that's, so that ink gets transferred like the trunk of the tree and the leaves of the trees. Because of the way Mesotin works, you get these very deep inky blacks, which, unfortunately we're doing it digitally. It's amazing in person when you see how deep, how the variations, the tonal variations of those blacks really are that he gets. I was going to say something else. So that's a Mesotint, what a Mesotint is. Okay. And now we're going to talk about etchings. So etchings and aquatints use acid to eat away at the metal plate. So the metal plate is covered with what's called a ground, which is a soft material, like usually kind of a waxy material, which then the artist will draw into it using a sharp tool. And then it will be submerged in acid, and the acid bath will etch that line that exposed the plate will get etched. by the acid bath, and then they take it out of the acid and they clean off the ground and they have the etching from the acid. It allows the quality of your line to be a little bit more freer, because as opposed to doing an engraving when you're doing that metal on metal, when you're using your tool on the metal plate directly, you have it's harder to make a real kind of drawing line. Okay. And aquatint is, instead of using a metal tool to scratch a line in, it uses a powder that makes a grainy kind of soft surface. So it creates a different more of an atmospheric effect on the print. Okay. So this is a print by Francisco Goya, which is a combination of etching and aquatint. And this is also something that was from a series, a portfolio series of images. We only have the one, but that's why it has the title at the bottom and it has a number at the top, because it was from a portfolio of works. So basically, the part down here where the figures are traditionally etched, and this background in the sky where it's kind of this soft kind of fuzzy gray, that's the aquatint. Okay, so here you can see that this is like the lines where the kind of the trees and the growth are. This is all part of the etching, and this kind of soft mottled gray is the aquatint. So you can see you can get a very different effect depending upon what process you use. And very often, there's a combination of etching and aquatint and sometimes dry point within the same plate. So it can be using a combination of techniques is very common. So this is I'm just going to go back and give you a little idea of so you can see the difference of the line quality. Whereas on the left is the etching and aquatint, where it's a much freer, easier line, looks more like a drawing to you, probably. And on the right is the engraving, which is a much harsher kind of that cross-hatching look. So you can really see the difference in the line. So when an artist is choosing what method to use, this would have an impact on what they would decide on, depending on what they wanted their final product to look like. Okay. So now, this is a Romeo Bearden print that is an aquatint and a photo etching. Romeo Bearden was an American artist, 20th century artist, who was mainly known for his collages. So when he started to work in prints, he wanted his prints to look like collages. So this is not a collage, it is a print. But he created multiple plates in order to create that effect that it looks like a collage. And photo etching, it's a way of the simple explanation would be you're developing the photograph on the etching plate. So so you're using a light sensitive ground and putting the negative on, and then you're exposing it, and then that's how you would create the plate. So the part that looks like watercolor is really aquatint. Romeo Bearden is a hard one to kind of categorize, because he was very much known for printing out an image off the printer, and then he'd take it home and he'd do other stuff to it. We have other ones in the collection where we have little notes that he wrote about, oh, this is a wrong color, I want to do that. Or we have some that are hand paint, that are watercolor and hand painted, because he would often just print out a blank one and a brown ink, and then he would do something else to it. So whereas sometimes you have a very specific number of etchings or engravings by the same in the edition. Sometimes with Romeo Bearden, it's hard to tell, because he did many that he did handwork on afterwards. So they're not all the same. And this is a more recent print by the artist David Shapiro, which is an etching and a photopolymer intaglio, which also is, he did photo expose some of this to be on here. So this is actually two pieces of paper that were then joined together afterwards. So there's basically two square images that were put together afterwards. So just to give you, so the imagery of a print runs from very representational to very abstract. So, and as I think you can see that with all the different types of artists that I've shared with you so far. Okay, so now we're going to move on. So we did relief prints where the surface was printed. We did intaglio prints where the incised was what's printed. Now we're going to go on to the planographic prints that are not either raised or incised. It's flat plane. So there's two types, it's lithographs and screen prints. So we're going to talk about lithographs first. Lithographs are based on the principle that oil and water don't mix. So they've been around for quite a while. 1798, Sennefelder, created the process. But one of the things about lithographs is it really allows you to capture the hand of the artist, and they very often look like drawings and can be seen as drawings. Sometimes people don't know that it's actually a print. So usually lithography is done with a stone. There are variations, but generally it's a stone. They take a greasy crayon or a paint and work their image onto the stone. It's chemically treated and then dampened, and then when the ink is put on, it adheres only to the greasy areas, not the other part of the stone. Then when it's gone through the press, the ink goes from those greasy areas to the paper. Some of these processes are a little bit hard to just verbally display. So this just shows you what a lithograph stone looks like. And this is just an artist working on this isn't anything that we have in the collection, but an artist working on the stone. So you would draw right on the stone like that, okay? So it often can look very much like a drawing. So this is a lithograph by Henry Moore, a British artist. And I'm going to just show you, I think you can see, but in the detail that you can see, it looks like a drawing. It has very much that feeling like it looks like a drawing. And this is what I mean by I think sometimes people can get fooled into thinking that they are drawings. So Henry Moore was a sculptor, and this was a print that he did showing the different, I'm just going to go back a little bit, kind of different views of a figure. And it just happens that we have on campus, a couple people would know this, we have a Henry Moore upright motive number 9 on campus, and it very much relates to this lithograph that we have in our collection. I think you can clearly see that the sculptor was doing the lithograph, and he was kind of figuring out, different angles of a figure. So. And I think this is one of the ones I think can fool you into thinking it's a drawing. This is by James Mcneil Whistler. He did a series of lithographs of the Luxembourg Gardens in 1893 and 94. And part of the reason he liked lithography was because it was like drawing. And that resemblance to the drawing, because he was, is very much what he wanted to capture. But again, because it's a print, it can then be in multiples. So that makes it a little bit different. So. And this isn't just another example. Ivan Albright, another lithograph, but very much more complex rather than the Whistler, which is very simple. This is a much more complex drawing on the stone to create this lithograph. So you can get all different types of, imagery out of it. All right. So I'm going to talk, the last category is screen prints. which is also it's a planographic process, and it's kind of like more like a stencil. And I'm just going to show you the next slide here. So this is just an example. This is not something in our collection, but just an example. On the upper right here, you have what the screen looks like. It's a wood frame with a screen in front. There is a resist that's put on the screen that blocks out the image, and then the ink is squeezed from the stencil through to the paper, and then when you lift up the stencil, the screen, you can see the image on the paper.
You have to show the squeegee.
In this case, you don't have the reversal of the image because it's not, because the ink is getting pushed through the top of, like the inside of this. Well, that's clear. So screen printing was very much a commercial printing process, especially in starting in the 1930s. But then after that, a number of pop artists like Robert Indiana and Andy Warhol started to adapt the screen printing technique for fine art in the 1960s. So what screen printing allows you to do is to have these large areas of really saturated flat color, and you also can photographically reproduce the resist on the screen, so it becomes a photo screen print. So this particular one is by Helen Frankenthaler. You would then also need, as I had mentioned at the beginning, every color you need a different screen. So this one, the white isn't part of the white on the outside. This white on the outside is not part of the print. I just wanted to differentiate from my background. So this paper has a blue, a green, and a yellow screen. So you would have to line them up and squeeze the color through for each one. So while it can look fairly simple, it still is a process of 3 different screens to create the print. And this one is another one that is a kind of a combination, because you have the flat saturated color. This is Andy Warhol from his Reigning Queen series. You have the flat saturated color of the background and some of the elements, but then the portrait of her and her face and her body is photographically reproduced via the screen print. So you would pretty much, the best way to say this, expose the screen print using a photosensitive, light-sensitive photo emulsion on the screen, and make the portrait part of it. And then you would have other screens that would have for the yellow, for the orange, for the green. So all those colors would have different screens. And one of the things I had done, our first Second Friday program in September was on Andy Warhol. And I talked a lot about how he reused his screens. He would take the screen from another process and reuse it for another artwork. And that's available on that program is available recorded on our website if you're interested in learning more about Andy Warhol. And one of the other things that a lot of the contemporary artists started to do late night in the 20th and up to today is they do a lot of combination of things and a lot of experimentation. This particular print, if you read in the thing, it says screen print and diamond dust. You can't really see it in the digital image, but there is literally diamond dust put onto the print, and it really does glisten and shine in the light when you see it in reality. But a lot of times artists were trying to see how they could manipulate the different print media to make the image that they wanted. So the combination, I didn't include it here, but we have a Vermeer Bearden print that's a lithograph and a screen print. We have some that are, the combination of different techniques, because as I mentioned, the different prints techniques give the artist a different look. So they would decide what they were going to do depending upon that. And this is the Joan Snyder print that I had started with. And this was a very interesting print because she uses a lot of different technology. She did this in collaboration with a master printer through Rutgers. They have a print studio there where she's combining digital technology with screen printing. So what she did was she drew her design on Mylar with black ink, and then the drawings were transferred to separate screens, one for each color. And then the separate screens were digitized, and the proof was created from that. And she also incorporated this Prismacolor, which is kind of this I don't know what the chartreuse color that's on the print is hand applied. So it's a combination of screen printing, digital printing, and then hand coloring. So a lot of artists today are not necessarily doing just an etching or just a woodcut. A lot of times they're combining the different processes to do that. And so I'm just going to give you a little, so if anybody has questions or comments or anything, I wanted to just add one more thing because it's hard to describe these printing processes, and there's a lot of good videos out there that you can find. On the Museum of the Modern Art site, they have an interactive little clip that tells you about different printmaking processes. And another site that really has some really good videos is the Khan Academy in their section called Introduction to Printmaking. They'll show you little videos where they show you how they run the prints through the press. I didn't have enough time to do that for everybody, for every type that I was talking about. So that it really helps if you're confused about the actual process of printmaking. How the plate looks and what it goes through and how they ink it. They go through all of those steps. With talking about all these different, in general, it's hard to do that in the time frame that we had here. So, I don't know if anybody. Okay, Carol had a question. Make the drawing first, or does the artist make the wood or piece of ink will transfer from? I think it depends on the artist, Carol, but I think in general, most artists do a drawing first because the process of cutting into the wood or engraving or etching a plate is a labor-intensive process. So they would want to know what the image that they were going to create before they started working on the block or the plate, I would think. Most artists that I know of did some kind of drawing beforehand. The one I would say that maybe not as much would be the lithograph, because that one they could just draw with the crayon on the stone, where they might do it more freehand. They might do it without more preparation. But most artists worked from some kind of drawing, and actually we have in our collection, I didn't include it, there's just too many things to include. We have a Robert Kipnis where we have the drawing, the plate, and the print that came from it. So we have that series of things so you can see how it, we used it when we did an exhibition, but I didn't include it here. I could keep talking about this, and I've already been talking for almost an hour, so it could go on very long. So does anybody have any other? Okay, so I'm looking at work is signed, not numbered. Not, as I mentioned at the very beginning with edition numbers are fairly recent. definitely 20th century and more towards, you know, mid-century on. If it was done by if it was done with a print house, they would keep track of how many were printed. If you, for example, there's a couple printmaking houses like United Limited Art Editions, where they would keep track of how many they actually printed. So part of the edition number isn't going to tell you whether it's an original. I mean, it would give you a clue that it's a lithograph. With a lithograph, it's really, you really have to look under the microscope, you know, kind of with a loop, and really look at how the ink is on the paper. That would help to tell you. Because with a lithograph, because it's a planar surface, you don't have a plate mark. Whereas with an engraving or an etching, because it's incised there, you have a plate mark where you can see the edge of where the plate was. I'm just going to go back so I can show you what I'm talking about, so that you would, let's see. I don't know if you can't really, it's hard to see here, but along the edge of this color, there's actually an indent in the paper that shows you that that was where the plate was, that the image went all the way to the edge of the plate. So that that's where that we could tell that is an etching, because there's a plate mark. A lithograph doesn't have a plate mark, so it is much more difficult to tell. So it's really to tell whether it's an original drawing or a lithograph. It's really investigating about the artist, what they did, looking at the actual piece of paper itself to see if you can tell, because the ink, whether it's a drawing or whether it's a print, a print is going to have ink, and if it's a drawing, it might be more pencil, so it's hard to really tell without seeing it.
Another question, a comment from James White, and then a few more questions
Okay.
In the chat.
Go ahead. Oh, thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate it. If you use a different plate for each color, does that mean the artist has to do the same really 4 times? Usually, and this is one of those things, if you watch the video, I think it's clearer. If they're doing, let's see, I'm going to go back. Let's see. I'm going to go back to a color print so I can say, okay, for instance, on this one, you wouldn't have, she would have cut out, there would have been 3 wood blocks, right? There would have been a black, a blue, and that yellowy gold color, right? So they would all be the same size on the outside. So she would just cut around, you know, so that she would raise that yellow on the glass. And the part where that's by the hat would be, so she wouldn't have to, on the yellow block, she wouldn't have to cut like the hand in the background. She wouldn't have to cut out the piano keys. So it's not doing everything. You're only going to cut out the part that's going to be printed yellow. So if, and I know with the Japanese woodblock prints, they don't even do it. They don't even necessarily cut out the whole thing again and again. They'll cut out, if they're only going to use gold, you know, or, you know, in this little, in whatever little part they're going to use it, they'll make a small block, and they'll just make, and they just mark it so it registers in the right place. So it's not necessarily always a full size another block. but it is another block if they're using color, if that color. Like, for example, in this one, if they were just doing the green, which is only in the top half of the print, they may not use a whole block. They may use like a half block. And then they would just line it up so that it prints in the right place, which is part of that, what I talked about registration at the beginning, that lining up each block so it prints in the same exact spot. How long does it take? Carol wants to know how long it takes. If I've seen a video of some contemporary Japanese woodblock artists doing these prints. They are amazingly fast. But that's just printing, not cutting. Carol, did you talk about cutting the blocks or printing the blocks?
I meant the printing.
The printing? The printing, once you have the block and you have the block inked, it's a matter of running it through however many times. Now, the Japanese woodblock prints are hand done. They're not put through a press, so it's a little different process. But when you do something like with the Allison Saar, they would run through. This is only an edition of 18. This is what the woodcut on the screen. It says woodcut 13/18. That's our edition number. So they were only 18. So they would have taken 18 sheets of paper and run them through. Without looking at it, I can't tell in person. I can't tell which was done first. But they would have run it through 18 sheets with black, lined up the sheets again, stacked them up, run 18 sheets through with the blue, 18 sheets through the gold. Once they're registered and they're lined up properly. So there were probably 18 that came out good. They may have had to put 25 pages through to make sure. That was one thing that I kind of skipped over at the beginning. I just want to say, because they are done in multiples and it's a very much a collaborative process. Some artists are solely printmakers, but most artists work in a bunch of different media, and they often work with a printmaking studio to help them create what they want the end product to be. So there are what we call proofs that are done, right? So a proof is something that's going to be run through, and if an artist thinks they're ready, they think they're done, they think it's the way they want it to be, they'll run it through the machine to see if that's good. So sometimes it's not, and they'll go back and they'll make changes. And then once it's ready, then they'll run it through they'll start running it through the press. So in addition to the edition, excuse me, there could be a printer's proof, which oftentimes they would often give it to, they would run one through and make sure that everything was working all the way through, and that the artist would kind of sign off on that's what I want it to look like. There could be artist's proof. So 18 is the edition that was basically kind of for sale. There could be another 2 or 3 artist proofs. There could be a couple printers proofs. So the total number could be more like 25. I don't know about this. I don't know about the specific print. When you do research on prints, often especially if there's a catalog raisonné on the artist, they'll tell you in the description of this print, okay, this print, there were, an edition of 18, then there were 2 printers proofs, 5 artist proofs, and, 10 special proofs for somebody else. So that if you're doing research on a particular artist on a particular print, you should be able to find out how many were made total. So, but it's part of because it is very much a collaborative process, so it's a little bit, how they work. Any other questions for me? I'm just going to go to my end here. Sorry, I didn't intend to go back. So I just want to say thank you all for joining us, and to give a plug for our next Second Friday session, which is November 13th at 3 p.m. And I mentioned at the very beginning, we have a large collection of African art in our collection, and we have about 280 artifacts in our collection. And we're going to be talking about that, and I'm going to be joined by Professor Veronica Lippincott, who's going to talk about it from her perspective, so it's not just me talking about it from an art perspective. So, and all of our programs are listed on our website, and you can find more information and updates about things we're doing there. We're also on social media, so if you want to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, you can follow us there. So if anybody have any additional questions or any comments that they want to make. If you want to take off, if you want to just ask, you can turn off your microphone and turn on your microphone, excuse me, and just ask if you want. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thanks, Carol.